Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listener. I'm on the way home from the library with some books and some music and a movie or two. It's a delightful journey for certain. I hope that you are having a pleasant day, and I'm looking forward to talking with you a little bit. So I've mentioned a number of times that when I try a game in digital form, the learning arc or learning experience is very different. And so I often don't talk about games that I've been playing only on asynchronous digital form in the same episodes where I'm talking about other games in my quick review segments shooting from the hip. Generally, the reason I do that is because, like I said, the experience is different, so it's nice to set those aside and kind of make the caveat once instead of having to say that for every game. Like if I did one per shooting from the hip episode, I'd have to keep saying that. So instead, I set them aside, and then I can do them all at once in a kind of mega review, and that's what I'm doing today. This is shooting from the chip quintuple shot. Pew, 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 pew. Wow, listen to those cicadas. Sounds kind of sci-fi, doesn't it? All these cicadas. It does. So I have, in the past couple months, tried out 5 new games on Board Game Arena that I have not played in person. So these are games that I've tried in digital form, either Board Game Arena or other places. These are all Board Game Arena. And I've had varying success or varying levels of engagement with them. And so I wanted to talk about them a little bit. Special shout out goes to Gabriel Edge. Proofpad is the username that Gabriel uses. We play a lot of games on Board Game Arena and some on Yucata and occasionally on Bois de Jeu too, now that I think about it. And it is with Gabriel that I've been exploring more new games than anybody else. So I wanted to say thank you to Gabriel for helping me find these new games and try them out. If anybody else has games they like to play, we have a community group on Board Game Arena for the Pick Up and Deliver Guild. And I encourage you to go there. If you send me a message, Wombat929 is my username. I'll invite you into that community group, and then we can play games with one another. So if any of these games sound interesting to you, why not start up a game with some of the people in the community group? Well, how about that? What about that, I say? What about that? Okay. So here are the 5 games, and I'm gonna engage with them sort of in reverse order. So the game I liked sort of least to the game I like most. So I'm gonna start with Memoir 44. Now this is a game I'd never gotten the chance to play on the table, so it was really fun to get to play it in Board Game Arena. I think that the mechanism so if you haven't played it, Memoir 44 is a sort of light war game set in Europe in World War II. I think it's, the storming of the Normandy or the battle for Europe. Allies versus Axis. I think generally it's American forces versus German forces. I don't know for certain that that's the case always, but I'm pretty sure that's what we played. The game is set around, I believe, the commands and colors system, which focuses on this idea that you have these cards that allow you to advance your different units, and you draw cards each round, and that lets you do stuff with your units, and you never quite know which ones you're going to get. And it represents the ebb and flow of the state of battle. And so you may not be able to move units at certain times, that you can only move them when it's opportune. It makes for a really interesting tactical play because you have to constantly be thinking about, well, what happens if I'm able to move these? How do I support them with other troops? The movement and combat systems are all relatively simple, and they're made even easier by Board Game Arena. You don't even have to remember really how they work. You just point and click at stuff. Although I'm sure that the fact that I didn't know very well how the combat system works meant that I wasn't as good with my tactical planning. And I would say that is the inherent challenge with all of these games, is that it takes me longer to learn the systems better because I don't have to physically move the pieces. It's a weird gap that I've talked about too many times to recount again. But the difficult choice of when to use your cards and which cards to use to do things is really interesting. And I can see why this game has stood the test of time. If you're looking for an interesting war game, it feels like you could do a lot worse than Memoir 44, especially at the sort of welcoming level or welcoming plus level where this game resides. You know, this is the physical version is published by Days of Wonder, same folks who make Ticket to Ride, and it's meant to be that kind of accessible level. So that's Memoir 44 on Board Game Arena. The next game I want to talk about, I played as part of a Board Game Arena tournament, and this is Blooms. This was a abstract game in which you and one other person are playing tiles onto a board, hex tiles, and the tiles are one color or another. There are 4 different colors to be played, and you can play, if you're on one team, you play blue or I think yellow or red tiles, and the other play is brown or blue. I don't remember the color scheme, but the idea is if a set of your tiles gets surrounded by another color, then all the tiles in there are removed. And so you have a push and pull in which you're trying to open up space to keep your tiles from getting removed, but at the same time setting up your opponent's tiles to get removed. And then you have this additional challenge in which if you spend a lot of time surrounding your opponent's pieces early, you can end up in a position where your pieces get surrounded late because you were too bunched up or something. It's a really interesting push and pull. It is a 2-player abstract game, and that's why it's lower on my favorite list, just because there's a limit to how much I want to play that. I generally like games with a bit more story to them, even if the story is somewhat abstracted. But as far as 2-player abstract games go, Blooms is pretty fun, and I urge you to give it a try if you think that sounds interesting. That's Blooms. Next up is a game I am playing currently and have been for months. This is The Crew Mission Deep Sea. So if you're not familiar with The Crew, this is a collaborative trick-taking game where the group will have a goal or a series of goals that you're trying to meet. It is a pretty standard trick-taking game as far as trick-taking games go. There are 4 suits. There is an additional 5th trump suit. If you lay the highest card in the suit that was led and no trumps are played, then you win the trick. You go until in the Crew Deep Sea, which is the second game in the series. The first one was called The Crew Quest for Planet 9. In the Crew Deep Sea, you get the way the cards are dealt out for a 3-player game, which is what I'm playing. One person has 1 extra card, so they will have 1 card that they don't play, and everybody else has a normal, even number of cards. So the difficult part, or the part that makes it interesting, is that you have these challenges. And the idea in the challenges is that you're not supposed to talk about how you're going to win the challenge. Like, you don't talk about what cards you have. I'm not sure what the rule book says about how much information you can share, but nonetheless, the game wants you to work together to solve the puzzle of how do you win these tricks in a way that completes the mission. And one of the really interesting things about the Crew Deep Sea versus the Crew Quest for Planet 9 is in Deep Sea there's a little deck of goals, and each round you're going to deal a certain number of those goals out and then distribute them among the players. And each goal has a certain weight of points, and you deal until you have that many points of goals on the table. And so the number of goals I believe is varying, or it might be that the game tells you deal this many goals of this size. I don't quite remember, in part because I haven't played it on physical form. I've only played it digitally. And then you divide up the goals and see who's gonna do what. Now I've heard a number of reviews talk about that they think the Crew Deep Sea is more interesting than the Crew Quest for Planet 9. The major difference between the two is the system by which you get those goals. In the Quest for Planet 9, there are, I think, 50 missions or something, and each mission has a specific goal that you're trying to meet. So when you do the mission, you open the booklet, it tells you what your goal is. In the Crew Deep Sea, like I said, there's this deck of mission cards, and the different missions tell you how many of those mission cards to draw, but then as a group, you assign them, and so the game is a lot more variable. It also swings a lot more wildly in terms of the difficulty of achieving these goals. I also think it's harder that we have, when we played our way through the Crew, the original Crew, we did have some times where we failed missions, but not a ton of them. And it feels like this game, we have far more times where we're failing a number of missions in a row because it's hard. And if you don't communicate, which you're not supposed to communicate as far as I can tell, then it remains hard. So, all in all, if you like trick-taking games, if that sounds interesting to you, you should definitely check out The Crew. It is a really interesting game, really important in terms of where people are thinking about cooperative games, that The Crew sort of creates this new space that people haven't really talked about much in terms of how games are going to interact, and it's well worth your time. And I would say, like I said, we play it asynchronously, which means it takes forever and probably reduces the fun quite a bit. I suspect that The Crew is much more interesting as a game if you're playing it sitting around a table, or play synchronously on Board Game Arena, where you're playing at the same time as other people and you're making your moves relatively quickly. That would help a lot with stuff like card counting. We have had a number of times where we lost because somebody kind of lost track of who had, say, run out of yellow and who had not. So that's a little bit of caveat emptor there regarding The Crew and playing it asynchronously on Board Game Arena. All right, 2 left. The next one I want to talk about is Riftforce. Riftforce is a really interesting card game in which you and another player are battling for supremacy of the board. There are a number of columns, and your goal is to, I think, win a column. When you win a column, you get something. I will confess, I played this a couple months ago, and if you said, hey, Brendan, let's play Riftforce today, I'd have to go skim the rules again. So this one did not sink in maybe as much as some of the other games that I'm either still playing or have played more recently. But it was a really interesting way to set up the game. You have a deck of cards that you know what you're going to get because you draft them, just like Res Arcana, for example. And then you're going to put a mix of those cards into play. And basically each round you're going to play a card, and then the place where you played your card, that figure enacts its power. And the powers will sometimes be to attack the cards on the other side of the rank where you played it. Sometimes they will trigger damage in cards to the left or right of the rank where they played it, or they'll give health, or they'll move different cards around. And like any good card interaction game, there are lots of subtle nuances that you can do where you play one kind of card and then you play another kind of card after it, and it augments or diminishes the power of one of the cards, that it spreads out the life, or it maneuvers things in a way that's beneficial. There's the level of interaction and the level of depth that's created through this series of small rules is really pretty fascinating. And it's a game that I think is probably one of those ones where if you got into it, you could play it a lot. And there's an awful lot of trying to anticipate what the other person's going to do, seeing what they have out on the board and thinking about how to manipulate it to your advantage, kind of deciding when to give up on a rank or a column and when to stick it out and fight for it. All of these things are a key part of Riftforce and really make for an interesting game. This is one I would definitely like to play on the table if I got a chance. And you should give it a try on Board Game Arena if you can. That's Riftforce. The last game I'm going to talk about today was a darling of the European board game set. It was nominated for the Spiel des Jahres this year. I don't think it won. I think Cascadia won, but it was nominated. And it's getting a lot of buzz, and that is Living Forest. Now, Living Forest to me feels an awful lot like Mystic Vale. If you've played Mystic Vale, in that game you have a deck of cards, you are revealing cards, and each card that you reveal adds to your power in a couple different ways, and some of them can add negative symbols. If you ever have more than 3 negative symbols in your field, then you bust and your turn is significantly reduced. That is the same mechanism that's at the heart of Living Forest. You have a deck of cards. Each card that you play provides, I think in this game it's 5 different kinds of resources, and there's a 6th bad symbol. And if you ever get 3 bad symbols, then you bust and you only get to do 1 action. Whereas if you don't bust, you get to do 2 actions. So you literally only get half a turn if you bust. What's interesting about Living Forest, so that's the basic mechanism. Of course, in Mystic Vale, the thing that's interesting about that is that you buy cards that then augment other cards. You don't do that in Living Forest. You do have other cards that you can buy. In a nice twist, when you buy a card, it goes on top of your deck instead of the bottom. So if you're able to buy a bunch of cards, you're kind of guaranteed to get some good benefits. I like that. There's so many games, especially games where you buy a card and it goes on your discard pile, where you might actually never get to play the card that you bought. And that's kind of a bummer. By contrast, in Living Forest, your next turn you get to play the card that you bought because it goes on top of your deck. After you've accumulated the 5 different resources, which are roughly analogous to different elements, then you get to do 2 actions on your board. And those actions contribute to some of the different win conditions. And this is the other place where Living Forest is really interesting as a game. So there are 4 or 5 different win conditions in Living Forest, different ways that you can win. Some of them are about getting a certain number of a kind of token. Some of them are about completing a display. Some of them I think are just about getting points. I'd have to go back and look to see what exactly they are, but what's interesting is that you have these 5 different resources, and each one lets you do a different thing that kind of advances you toward one of those win conditions. But the trick is, of course, you kind of have to specialize if you want to get far enough toward one of those win conditions that you actually achieve it before the other players. So there's an element of a race, and it being a race is really important. Otherwise, a push your luck game is never going to be fun, because why would you push your luck if there's no race element? But if you think anybody who doesn't bust gets double the turn of somebody who busts, maybe you don't push it as much, and then you do 2 actions that advance you toward 2 of the win conditions, whereas somebody who busted only gets to advance toward 1 of them. It's an interesting dynamic that really, I think, works well. If you like Mystic Vale, I would say definitely give Living Forest a try. It's a little bit lighter, I think, but not a lot. Mystic Vale is not a deep game, or not a heavy game. And there's some depth there, but it's not heavy. So that's Living Forest, also available on Board Game Arena. This is a Board Game Arena episode. Hey, Board Game Arena, do you want to sponsor the podcast? Reach out. I will continue talking you up. So there we are. What games do you like on Board Game Arena? Reach out to me there. Wombat929 is my username, and we'll start a game. Or better yet, we'll start a game with other members of the Pick Up and Deliver podcast community who congregate there in that community group. You know where else they congregate? Over on Board Game Geek and Guild 3269. So head over there and share what games you like to play. Do you play on Boîte à Jeux? Do you play on Yukata.de? What games do you play there? Most of the time when I'm introducing new games, they're from Board Game Arena. But every now and again, I'll play a new game on one of those other platforms, and they're delightful too. So that's what I've been playing digitally and what I've been enjoying playing digitally. Please let me know what you've been playing digitally by heading over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269. We already talked about that. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.